Hey guys, so in the last lesson, we briefly touched on natural selection, which was the theory of evolution proposed by Charles Darwin. Today, we're just going to be diving much more in depth into natural selection. So for this lesson on natural selection, you need to know what the different requirements are for natural selection to occur. Then you have to describe the process of natural selection. You have to define adaptation and differentiate between the different types of adaptations. Then we're going to look at the different types of natural selection. We're going to briefly touch on artificial selection, and then we're going to look at the different types of speciation and what that is. So natural selection is the process that drives evolution. Essentially, it's causing traits to become more or less common in a population based on which traits are more beneficial according to the natural factors. It was first proposed by Charles Darwin, and he says that in order for natural selection to occur, four things must be true. So these are the four postulates or four requirements of natural selection. First, there has to be genetic variation in the population. The traits need to be heritable. So unlike Lamarck with his acquired traits, the traits have to be heritable. Some traits have to increase either the survival or the reproductive success of those organisms. And then the more successful traits need to get passed on to the offspring more often, since those parents survive longer and reproduce more. So Darwin said that due to the competition that exists between individuals of the same species, that's our intra-specific competition, it would result in survival of the fittest. Now, it is important to note that survival of the fittest does not mean like the most physically fit individuals survive. It means that the individuals whose traits best fit their environment would survive, and they would therefore pass on those traits more. He said that favorable variations would be preserved, so favorable traits essentially would stay in the population, and unfavorable traits, the ones that decrease survival, would go extinct. This would result in the species evolving as the genetic makeup of the species changes. Species can either evolve as a whole, so the entire species evolves, or part of the species can evolve and turn into a new species, essentially. Okay, so the forces of natural selection are any environmental condition or environmental pressure that is going to favor the survival or the reproductive success of some individuals over others based on their traits. Favorable traits are selected for and become more common. Unfavorable traits are selected against and become less common. And these forces can change over time. Traits that are favorable one year might be unfavorable a few years later if the environmental conditions change. These selective forces include the climate of the habitat. It could include things like predators, the intra and interspecific competition, diseases, lots of things like that. Any type of natural disaster, famine, all of those are going to be selective forces. Natural selection can have multiple different effects on the appearance of a trait in a population. Sometimes natural selection will select against the extremes of a trait and move the population towards like a more moderate version. Other times the selective pressure is like in terms of one of the extremes, and that trait will just become more extreme over time. Or natural selection can actually select for more than one trait at once, which causes different traits to become more common over time. Okay, adaptation. An adaptation is a trait that has evolved through the process of natural selection and currently has a function in the organism. Adaptation is also the evolutionary process where an organism is becoming better suited to its environment through natural selection. So an adaptation is both a noun, it's both the trait itself and the verb of adapting. So you can adapt to get a new adaptation. Adaptation and speciation are the two main evolutionary processes that explain how we have such a variety of different species on Earth. Both of these occur because of natural selection. All adaptations have to be beneficial to the organism. If it's just a new trait, but it's not beneficial, it's not considered an adaptation. It has to either improve survival or improve reproductive success. Populations must be able to adapt or they will go extinct. If you cannot adapt to environmental changes, you're going to die off when the environment changes. There's a couple different types of adaptations. Structural adaptations are when the physical features of an organism changes. So it changes its body shape or size, changes its coloring, its internal organs start changing. All of those are structural. Behavioral adaptations are changes to an organism's instincts or reproductive behaviors or ability to learn. Physiological adaptations include a new function. So venom production, toxin storage, phototropism, all of those are new functions that a plant or animal could adapt. And then homeostatic adaptations help an organism better control its internal environment. It has to do with regulating its internal environment. So like temperature regulation, so when species evolve to become like warm-blooded, for example, water or ion balance. So if a species evolves from being like salt water to fresh water or vice versa, that kind of stuff. Sexual selection is a specific type of selection where the selective force is based on reproductive success only and not on survival. And it can sometimes actually work against natural selection because sometimes a trait that is sexually selected for can actually decrease survival. So it's increasing reproduction, but decreasing survival. And sexual selection will happen anytime there's competition within the species for access to mates. So not everyone gets a mate. There are two different types of sexual selection. It can be intersexual selection or intrasexual selection. Intersexual selection is where one sex, usually the males, have to try and attract the other sex. This could be with physical features or with behavioral traits. So it might be like the bird with like the brightest colored feathers is the one that gets the females, or it could be like the one with the prettiest song gets the females. So it could be physical or behavioral. Intrasexual selection is where one sex, usually the males, physically compete with one another, and then whoever wins just gets access to the females. So any trait that allows you to be better in a fight essentially would be selected for. So with intersexual selection, essentially the males are trying to attract the females will choose the male based on which traits they like the most. With intrasexual selection, it's not up to the females at all. The males fight, whoever wins becomes like the alpha male, and he gets whatever females he wants. Artificial selection is essentially when the selective force is not natural, but it's controlled by humans. So humans select for whatever traits we find desirable. They might not always be the traits that are in the best interest of that organism, but they're the ones we like. All domesticated animals and crops are the byproduct essentially of artificial selection. And yeah, it does often work against natural selection. Okay, so that's it for natural selection. So again, just kind of recap all of that. Natural selection is when something in the environment is selecting for certain traits or against other traits. So for example, if there is, a shortage of food and all of the food is really high, organisms or individuals of that species that can reach the higher food will survive more. So any trait that makes like an organism taller or have longer arms or anything like that would be selected for. The short ones would be selected against. And then sexual selection is when the sexual behaviors essentially of different species select for or against different traits. Okay, speciation. It's another evolutionary process. This process is essentially how we get new species. Speciation usually requires reproductive isolation, meaning that the populations cannot be exchanging genetic information or reproducing with one another. This is essentially what Darwin recognized when he said that, like, as soon as you have like organisms on two separate continents, they're going to evolve separately because they're no longer exchanging genetic information. There are 4 different types of speciation. There is allopatric, peripatric, parapatric, and sympatric. Allopatric speciation is when the population is like physically split in two and one half becomes genetically and geographically isolated from the other. So not only are they not sharing genetic information, they can't migrate or immigrate from one to the other. They are geographically isolated. This could happen because of like a natural disaster, like if there was like, you know, a little stream and all of a sudden it flooded and now those populations on either side of this little stream can't get across anymore. Or it could be because of like habitat fragmentation. So if like a big highway gets cut through the forest and now the individuals on either side of the highway can't interact anymore. And essentially these two separate populations will now start to evolve slightly differently from one another. Maybe a new mutation pops up in one population that doesn't pop up in the other. Maybe the selective pressures in the two populations are slightly different, but they're going to start evolving different traits over time until they're so genetically different from each other that they're two different species. So that's what this is kind of showing down here. You have this like initial population. The two halves become genetically and geographically isolated from one another. And then over time, the top population becomes like more green. The bottom one becomes more like beigey, and then they're two totally different species. To the point that even if that like flooded river dried up again and they could interact, they won't anymore. They're too different from each other. This is showing the same thing here, only it's like in a lab. Okay, then we have peripatric speciation. This is when you have a small portion of the original population that is leaving the original population and colonizing a new area. This could be just like a group of birds that got like blown away from the colony, or maybe there was like a tsunami and it like picked up some of the, you know, whatever mammals and moved them to a new place. Once again, there's not going to be any genetic information moving between the original population and that new little colonized one. And so they're going to evolve unique traits and become genetically different. So that's what this is showing down here. We have the original population, a small group goes and colonizes a new area, and it evolves new traits until it becomes a new species. Then we have parapatric speciation. This is when you have one really large habitat, and then across that large habitat, the environmental conditions start to differ, and therefore you have different selective pressures on the kind of different ends of the habitat. There is still going to be some gene flow between the two different sides of this one habitat, but it is going to be limited. And eventually you'll have kind of different traits evolving in those two different ends of the one population. And in the middle, again, there will still be some interbreeding. There is still some genetic flow there, but you end up having this kind of hybrid form, and the hybrid is selected against. So the hybrid becomes less common until you just have these two separate populations on the two ends. So that's kind of what this is talking about here. So like you have this large habitat here. Over time, say like this area becomes really cold and this area becomes warmer. And so the fish in the colder area become like fattier to insulate themselves. The other side are nice and tiny. And any individuals in the middle are going to be selected against. Another way you could think of this is like, so say you had, again, one large habitat like this, but it's terrestrial, it's on land. And one area is becoming colder and one area is becoming warmer. And in the cold area, they're evolving stubby legs, thick fur that insulate themselves and preserve body heat. So they're like fat, stubby, fluffy. In the warm area, they're becoming like thin, longer limbed, so they have more surface area and less fluffy. And then in the middle, in the hybrid zone, you have individuals who are getting a mix of both of those traits. So maybe they're like super fluffy, but also super skinny. Or they're short and stubby, but have no hair. Those mixtures of traits are not useful for anything. And so that hybrid is selected against in that kind of hybrid zone until you just have the ones that are really well adapted for the cold, the thick, fluffy guys, and the ones really well adapted for the warmth, the thin, less fluffy ones. Okay, so that's the parapatric speciation. And then lastly, we have the sympatric speciation, which is where two different species evolve in the same geographic region. So they're in the exact same place, but they usually evolve different behavioral traits from one another. So for instance, you might have the two different individuals or the different groups in that population, but one starts only coming out at night and one only comes out at the daytime. And so since they're never out at the same time anymore, they're not like reproducing with each other. So they become two genetically isolated populations, even though they're geographically in the same place. So yeah, usually this is a difference in reproductive behaviors. So whatever they're like doing to try and attract mates is like different from each other, or they might be active at different times. They might start using different food sources, stuff like that. So this example here with the butterflies is where one group evolves to be active at nighttime, the other is active at daytime, and then the nighttime ones adapt different traits to better camouflage at night in this case. And so even if you put them together again, they wouldn't interact with each other. This one is a similar example where one group has evolved to live on a different type of apple, a different color of apple. And so those two species stop interacting with each other until they become so genetically distinct that they will not reproduce anymore. So with all of these different types of speciation, essentially what it is reducing or completely cutting off the reproducing of the two different groups with one another, so they become genetically isolated. There's no more genes flowing or moving between the two populations. And then as soon as they're genetically isolated, traits that pop up or form as an adaptation in one group are not necessarily going to form in the other group. And so they evolve different traits over time. They're not sharing those traits. And so they become two totally different species. Okay, I know this was a lot to kind of wrap your head around with all of the different natural selection stuff and all the different speciation stuff. So go through, read over this lesson again, and then let me know if you have any